Hello, welcome to Postcolonial Space. I'm Masood Raja, and today I briefly want to introduce South African and Botswanan author Bessie Head's short story, A Deep River. But before I go into the story, I would like to first introduce Bessie Head herself and a brief biography of her as a person as well as an author. And then I'll briefly talk about the short story. Now I'm teaching this short story this semester, and since right now in Texas we are in a snowstorm and we are sans water, electricity and everything else, but I do have to deliver some instruction to my students so that they can stay on target. So that's why I'm recording this. So I apologize in advance if the quality is not so good, but I hope that this brief introduction to Bessie Head and one of her short stories could be of some use. So Bessie Head was born in South Africa of a mixed-race union. And what that means is that during the apartheid regime of South Africa, of course, it was illegal for white and African people to get married or even officially be together. Bessie Head's mother was from a prominent white family, and she had an affair with one of the stable hands. And when she got pregnant, of course, the parents absolutely didn't want anything to do with the baby, so they sent her off to give birth to the baby. The baby was immediately adopted by a foster family, but when they learned that the baby was not necessarily fully white, they returned it, and she was then adopted by another family who treated her well and raised her in a Christian household. But the trauma of that kind of childhood followed Bessie Head throughout her life. Later, after she gets her education and becomes a journalist and becomes active on the fringes of the ANC and other movements for racial justice, and that's when she also starts writing. She marries eventually, and that's how she gets her last name, Head. And then after she gets in a little bit of trouble with the South African authorities, she goes to Botswana, moves there, and pretty much never returns to South Africa. And it takes her a while, but that's where she gets her citizenship. And that's where she produces most of her work, I think 3 novels and collections of short stories. She also worked at an experimental school in a small village of Sirau. And if you want to read up on it, you will see that my mentor, Robin Goodman, has a good book chapter on the model of education that school followed. One of the best novels by Bessie Head is A Question of Power, which is kind of a cerebral novel, but a lot of people believe that she was trying to deal with her own nervous breakdown. But that's what I highly recommend. Now, this story, A Deep River, is a pretty simplistic but highly complex narrative because it's an origin story in a sense as to how does a tribe come to be. And when you start reading the story, you will see that the beginning of the story is pretty interesting. The language is kind of like a sacred text or a historical text. It's slightly archaic, but it's also imbued with oral storytelling tradition. And she tells the story of a tribe that lived as an expression of the will of their chief. And the chief said, "Let the crops be sowed." People would go and start working on the crops. When the chief said, "Today we declare the crops must be harvested," everyone harvested. So she gives us an example of a community that lived in sync but was committed to the will of one single ruler, one single chief. And then the chief dies, and he has 4 sons. And a conflict arises because one of the 4 youngest wives of the chief gives birth to a baby. there are rumors that he is the son who's about to take over, that they had had an affair. And so then the new chief, who is about to take over, is brought in public and confronted with this woman and asked to decide whether that little boy was his son or their father's son. What's at stake is that if it is his son and he becomes the chief, then the lineage shifts, right? His son would then become the chief, and it cuts out his brothers, right? So the brother finally looks at the woman and looks at his tribe, and he does what is an act of individual will, right? He acknowledges this woman as someone whom he loves, and by that declaration then he introduces change into the tribe's culture, right? And so the tribe is divided. He is told to leave along with his wife and the child, and some people join him and decide to leave with him. And the word that they are used for him, you may go now, is called teleote, right? And so people who leave with him are the ones who form the teleote tribe. And then she ends the story with some people talking about the tribe as it exists, and saying this is how the tribe started. So when I teach it, and I apologize because I'm not using proper names of the characters, but of course you can look them up. I don't have the text in front of me. So I always tell my students that read it as a fictional origin story. But then keep in mind that most origin stories themselves are fictional. I mean, we don't know how George Washington felt. We have attributed certain things to him. There are certain historical events that he did, but every time we speculate what they thought, it's something that someone wrote or something that we believe. And if you go beyond, the pharaohs and Egyptians, some of it is recorded in the text, but it comes to us as a recorded text. We decipher it, we read it. Our sense of history is always an interaction with texts or monuments, and then what is written about them, or how do we translate them. So in the process of writing a short story, then Bessie Head is giving us an origin story of a tribe called Teleote, right? And if, let's say 200 years from now, someone finds that fragment of paper upon which that story is written, maybe to them that would become fact, that would become an account, a historical account of the rise of a tribe. And that's what I try to teach my students. And also the binary that she introduces, right? Starting from a world in which everyone's actions are connected to the will of a central authority, a chief, right? And that what introduces strife is an individual act of love of a man and a woman and their child. And that's what breaks that so-called harmony. But it doesn't destroy everything. There are certain people who remain. There is politics involved, right? His brothers want him out. And this becomes a convenient way of ousting him out of the tribe. But he doesn't just lose everything. Maybe through that act of will, by acknowledging the woman he loves, he then changes reality, right? These are some of the things that we can look into the story and talk about it. And then the deep river analogy is of this time, right, as it passes from past to the present and maybe keeps going to the future. And, that's how I encourage my students to read the story. Now, I'm obviously not really doing justice to the topic, and I apologize for that. But, if you've read Bessie Head, and if you have any questions about her life or about this particular short story or about any of her novels, I'll be happy to hear them, and I would be happy to try to answer them. But as authors go, I think Bessie Head, whom I consider a Botswanan author, had the best kind of writing, but also a tragic life because she dies at 48, so she was just becoming established as a writer. But by and large, she leaves us an interesting body of work, and a body of work that has the experience of apartheid behind it, but also a promising body of work because some of her non fictional works are about her experience at the Sirao village and with the school system that they established there for boys and girls, and which becomes a very successful school system. A little bit about that school system. The kind of education that they introduce there is a mixture of scholastic education and real life skills. So, what the female students did was they learned, but then they also learned a trade or they learned something to do which they could use as a skill. Similarly, the boys were separate. They learned the scholastic skills, but they also learned farm work, husbandry, and the school produced its own food. So it was a self sustaining school model. A school model that wasn't just about factual education, it also taught the students to cope with the world and reality in which they live. And then practice a kind of living in which everyone comes together and is part of a community. And quite a few scholars, including my mentor, Robin Goodman, have pointed to that model of education as something that could be used in United States and elsewhere in opposition to the corporatized model of only skill-based, test-based school system that we have over here and elsewhere in the world. So these are some of my thoughts about Bessie Head. Not very focused, not very detailed, but I do hope that these are useful to you and that it encourages you to explore more of Bessie Head's work and read some of her short stories or novels. Thank you so much. I will now see you next time. Until then, peace and love.